Today, Liss and I are going to be exploring the topic of dissent. I'm sure some of us are familiar with dissent on a social level or particularly a political level. But what is dissent when it's an internal thing or an experience that we have with our personal or professional relationships? Dissent.
Hi, and welcome to Light for Life. If you are returning to our channel, thank you. We value and appreciate you. Our aim is to shine a bright light on your inner splendor and assist to connect you to your magnificence via what we intend to be enlightened sharing, potentially educational and hopefully entertaining information, as well as encouragement for new perspectives. If you are new here, you are most welcome. We do hope that you will find our content highly beneficial and enjoyable. I am Liss. I'm a science of mind practitioner and a teacher of various healing modalities applicable to all aspects of the self and this life.
And I am Lori. I am a holistic wellness researcher and educator. Welcome to Connections with Liss and Lori. We use the space to offer our perspective regarding multiple different topics that we certainly hope you find inspiring. Dissent, basically by definition, I guess could be described as a very strong opposing belief, a philosophy. What are we opposing? Well, we're opposing, I guess, the majority, or even internally, we're opposing our own very strong beliefs up against someone else's very strong beliefs. And that's where we can experience disharmony, disruption, misalignment, obstruction to the flow. It's kind of when we bump up against something that makes us pause and reflect. Something doesn't quite feel right here. Something feels at odds, some might say. And it really is an opportunity, like everything else in life, it's an opportunity to pause and reflect where our beliefs are bumping up against something that might really be a higher truth that we're feeling come to the surface that just isn't matching up somehow in some way. And an opportunity to look at where our energy really is flowing. So when you look at life through the lens of creative force or a creative process, this is one of those bumps in the road that we can meet up with. And I mean, it can be bumpy, you know, we can trip over ourselves, but it's just another opportunity to really examine everything. Examine the situation at hand, the conversation that you're having, society norms, hot political debates. I'm sure you're familiar with that as well, right?
Yeah, Laurie, for me, the easiest way to understand any topic is to look at its opposite. So with dissent, it's no different. So I ask myself, if I truly want to understand the nature of dissent, what do I think it's diametrically opposed to? And consent would be what seems logical to me. So when I look at consent and how I think that functions, what its purpose is and how it functions best, then that gives me personally clues about looking into my own potential dissent and why I might hold that. So to me, consent is when we're actually open to something. So yes, dissent would not only be strong, but it would also be fairly closed. So it's not just a strong opinion, but it's a closed mind. And potentially because of that, an oppositional one. So we can't possibly even contemplate whether our strongly held opinion or our fixed position is correct or not if we're not first open to the possibility that there might be more that we're not considering. So why would we do that? Why would we have a closed mind and a fixed opinion? And for me, it comes down to it's a defense mechanism to hold a mental construct that doesn't serve us or that is even potentially self-sabotaging. So in order to truly be open-minded, I would say we first need to feel safe enough to actually trust ourselves enough to be able to entertain a notion without necessarily adopting it, but open-minded enough to merely consider it, to consider whether it has any merit or not. And then not only do we need to feel safe enough, but we then need to be empowered enough to actually trust, first of all, our own intellect, and then secondly, our intuition, to be able to discern fact from fiction and to have a feel for the truth. And we can't experience any of those things when we're coming from some form of an egoic wound. Then we're going to kick right in to a defense mechanism. And so maybe that will look like too strong and too fixed and too rigid opinions and the resistance that dissent is. So the most important thing, I think, when it comes to consent is to understand the function of the will. What is the will and what role does it play in what we do or don't consent to? But before I elaborate on that further, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what I did share.
Well, I mean, of course, I agree completely. If we aren't open-minded, we can't possibly learn or grow or understand any more about ourselves, how we relate to the world, understand anything about others, and the world as a whole. This human experience is very fascinating, and it's very complex and multi-layered. And if we're not open to really learning anything more than we've learned so far, at the risk of sounding judgy, it's a waste. The life has so much to offer, and there's so much to learn. I always joke that the more I learn there is to learn. But it's, it's my way of trying to stay humble and remembering that we do have to have an open mind, even if there are times when we feel so sure about ourselves and our beliefs and our understanding of the world thus far. There's always so much more. Just by having a conversation with a stranger, a whole new world can open up if your mind is open to receiving a new experience.
And it's a balance, right? Because one of my favorite quotes from a long time ago, and I'm sorry, but I can't remember who said it, is that it is always the things that we are most sure of that are never true.
Mm.
And that stuck with me and assisted me personally to be more open-minded. But if we have the balance wrong, we can be so open-minded that, as that famous meme says, our brains fall out. And then we start believing things that are just totally wild, right? So there is a balance. There's a balance between trusting what we've learned thus far and being open to that potentially being wrong. So if I can come back to the will for a minute, I think a lot of people potentially don't really understand or even know that the will is karmic. And that doesn't have to be a spiritual concept that we have to adopt as an ideology. Karma literally just means action and the natural consequence of that action. So our will is what gets us to exercise choice And it is our choice that will move the energy that then has a karmic return. And so when we are functioning in our lower and our egoic will, what we're doing is we are forming our opinions and making our choices from a very limited perspective. Because our physical eyes can only see a tiny portion of the light spectrum, and therefore our physical brains can only contemplate a tiny amount of the potentially available information, we're limiting ourselves to that. And so our lower will is our most ineffective will because it has the least amount of information to go on. And so what that tends to cause is a stubbornness where we can only see one way. And everything becomes entrapped in a very dualistic way of thinking, right and wrong, black and white. And we narrow our possibilities to that spectrum. And that is largely powerless because the lower egoic will is going to attempt to force physical matter to change. Because our minds can only have this much information about physical reality and our eyes only see this much of the light spectrum of physical reality, the egoic will is going to attempt to act on physical reality, which is the hardest thing to change. Because matter is the densest form of energy, we're going to have a tough time. It's not impossible, but it's definitely hard. It's very, very hard. So if our first act of will actually be to surrender to our higher will, what we're doing is we're opening up the higher mind that has access to a broader perspective, more of the light spectrum, and more information. So that when we then make a choice, we're making it from that broader perspective, a greater perception. And so therefore, that will is more powerful.
The will can be very powerful, right? I mean, it can be, it can open up your whole world. It's very fascinating to hear you describe things that I've never really considered before. But I can't help but agree because, you know, the ego tries so hard to protect us and keep us safe and have us functioning and doing all of the things, but boy, it can get in the way. It can really get in the way of the creative force that we can tap into so easily if we just, you know, nudge ourselves up just a little bit, like you said, to that higher perspective and that higher knowing, really. And that knowing isn't something that we acquire. It's ours. It's always been there. It's just easy to overlook, easy to forget.
The thing is, the light as information functions as thought, and energy as information functions as emotion. Truth functions as will. So the ego is going to exert its will in line with personal truths.
Right.
Truths that aren't necessarily true. Truths
Right.
that aren't necessarily beneficial. But when we surrender to our higher mind, when we surrender to our higher will, when we allow for a broader perception, then we're actually aligned with the truth. And that's why that higher will is so much more empowered. We so often talk about the egoic will, and we use the word decide. I have decided. I don't know if you've noticed, just in common language, when you use the word choice and when you use the word decide. I have decided. It's very one way, stubborn. And if you examine the word decide, side is murder. And D is God.
Wow.
So to decide is to murder God. How do we
Wow.
murder God? Yes. How do we murder God? By not surrendering to our higher mind, by not
Mm.
following the higher will in the truth and in the light. When I murder that spark of the divine in me, who suffers? I do. I create a whole bunch of stuff I don't want, a whole lot of things that aren't going to work and never can, because they're attached to a personal truth that isn't true.
Wow. That took a turn I didn't see coming. This is fascinating.
But that's what choice and consent is all about. So when we are dissenting,
Yeah.
we are literally undoing
Hmm.
the consent that we could be giving to surrender to that higher wisdom that is in all of us
Yeah.
and can and does guide us if we'll just ask it to.
Yeah. If we have the courage to let go of what's familiar, because that's where we always gravitate toward. It's the autopilot, right? It's the automatic. We go with what's familiar, even if it's uncomfortable, sometimes unbearable. We go with what's familiar. So it does
Because
take
it's
just
safe.
yeah, and keeps us safe because familiarity is safety, right? So it does take a little smidgen of courage to go beyond what is familiar, go beyond what we perceive is safe because it's familiar, and just get curious. Just open to the light, like you said, to the light, and see what's behind that door.
Yeah.
Curiosity can really propel you forward when you're curious enough to step beyond what you know. My goodness, it's exciting. It's the juice of life. I also don't want to minimize how challenging it can be sometimes to step beyond what we know and step beyond the familiarity of our environment, the familiarity of our thoughts and our beliefs and our philosophies.
One thing that I have personally found very beneficial when it comes to that is to recognize that we do very, very little conscious consenting.
Mm-hmm.
Most of our consent is tacitly obtained from us, deceptively even. And so our consent, our focus, our attention, and our power, our ability to manifest and create is harnessed and used, usually against us. So to cultivate curiosity is to cultivate awareness. And the more we cultivate awareness, the more we're in the higher mind. So then when we consent, we are actually doing so consciously. We're doing it by making a deliberate choice. And that is empowerment. That is harnessing my power for my highest and best good, instead of tacitly and deceptively just granting it all over the
Mm-hmm.
place, unawares.
Mm-hmm. Right. Right.
And I think that is why to protest in a dissenting manner is actually disempowering,
Yeah.
because it's a form of begging. It's a form of looking to a power that is higher, bigger, and above us, but external, not the true higher power. And in a form of violence, even if there's no violent acts, demanding that physical matter change, whether that's circumstances or conditions or decisions, instead of accessing our own conscious power to make choices in line with higher will that will naturally change things for the better by virtue of love.
Yeah. Yeah. Uniting in love rather than, locking arms and battling.
Yeah.
Yeah. Love and light, light for life.
Yes.
Thank you for connecting with Light for Life. If you appreciate reminders, please go ahead and subscribe to the channel so you can receive those notifications. If you would like to work with one of us, You can find our contact information in the About section of this channel.
Yes, thank you for connecting with Light for Life. Please share your insights, your questions, and your comments with us in the comment section below. We value your feedback. And we really hope that we will see you for our next episode. We upload one every Thursday. Until then, bye-bye and be joyful.
Until we connect again, we send you love and light.